Well, thank you, Chris, and for all the work that you do, for our office and the folks that you have contact with and the facilities. I always like to start these boot camps off with a 5-mile run and some 20 burpees. So let's go. Oh, wrong boot camp. All right, that was a bad joke. All right, so seriously, folks, when I like doing these boot camps because it gives me an opportunity to sit down with Chris, talk to Chris, hear what she's hearing from you folks on what's going on your end, and kind of just mesh it all together to make sure we're doing the best to serve our clients and to serve your clients. When I was talking to Chris yesterday about this stuff and what we're going to present today, I found some common threads that we have with you folks. And one of those common threads is that we're here to serve our clients to the best of our ability. You are serving your patients, your clients, you're providing them with the best care you can. We are on our end providing the best legal services we can. And I think that, again, is a common thread that both you and our office holds together. The other common thread that we have, in my opinion, is that it is our goal to get our clients qualified for Medicaid as soon as possible with the least amount of flim-flam going back and forth with DHHS. And that should be a common thread that you folks have too, because what that means for you is not only are you providing the care to the best of your ability, but you're getting paid for your services. And it's very important to our office that you folks get paid. And it's very dear to our heart to get our clients qualified for Medicaid. But with Medicaid, I got to be truthful with you guys. It's like Alice in Wonderland. Okay, you never know what hole you're going to pop up in when you're dealing with DHHS and Medicaid eligibility. It's just crazy. And I know I'm preaching, but we've all seen the faces. I call them the what TF faces when we sit down with the families and we say, look at Medicare is not going to cover long-term care. Look at health insurance isn't going to cover Medicare or long-term care. Look at you're going to have to private pay to be qualified for Medicaid until you reach below $2,000, okay? And so what we're telling clients, you're telling your folks this too, is that although you've worked all of your life, you've saved, you've done everything that mom and dad have told you to do, now you've hit some rough bumps in life, you end up in long-term care, and you have to go broke before you get a benefit that you've been paying for all of your life, that is Medicaid. And so, show me a hand if you haven't seen this face, all right? Show me a hand if you haven't seen the despair in the family's faces when they find out the cost and they find out the limited resources there are out there to pay for the service. We've all seen it. Show me a hand if you guys have found no consistency with various DHHS offices. Show me a hand. We experience that on our end day to day. It's different from Allegan, it's different from Kent County, it's different from Ottawa. And not only is it the offices, but it's the caseworker. So there's no, in our opinion, and I'm sure it's in your opinion too, is that there's no consistency. The rules are being interpreted by different folks from different offices in various ways. And to me, this is very disheartening because there's no clear line that we can show our clients the walk on. And you guys probably experience that same thing because you may tell the clients one thing, but they may be going to a different county, working with a different office, and they're getting a totally different story. So I think that, it is what it is. We have to deal with these inconsistencies when we do this, when we plan for Medicaid eligibility. So when it comes to Medicaid eligibility, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so when I look at Medicaid eligibility, I do classify it in timing. So with timing at the first hour, you can pre-plan for this, okay? And I love Benjamin Franklin's quote here, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And so in the first hour, people can pre-plan, all right? They can see the storm and they can plan for the storm. And if they have planned for the storm, they're not going to be looking at losing everything that they've worked for all of their life, and they're going to be entitled to a benefit that they've paid for since day one. And so I call that hour one. If you start planning for this thing, it's going to be very good for you at the end of the day if you face the storm. And Medicaid eligibility is going to happen, and there isn't going to be a lot of flim flam going back and forth. And you're preserving what you've worked for, or what your clients have worked for. Okay, so the next stage in the game or the timing is, okay, like on this between, I would say the 10th and the 11th hour. So if people have not planned in the first hour, well, there's things that we can do on the 10th or 11th hour to try to preserve as much as we can for our folks. And some of those strategies are annuities. Some of those strategies are shifting assets between spouses. Some of those strategies are going into court and getting court orders. Okay, but again, it's timing. The 12th hour strategy is spend down. Now there's overlap between all of these different timing for phases that I've talked about. But what we're focused on here today is really the 12th hour, that things have really gone sideways for mom or dad or the spouse, and they haven't pre-planned for this. That is, they don't have trust, they don't have power of attorneys, they don't have anything, but they're in a state of shock regarding the cost and what to do. And so that's where spend down comes into play, I think, most often. Great. And so personally, I hate the word spend down, right? Because it puts a frowny face on my face, because I don't like being told what to do with my money. I don't like being told what I have to spend it on. But again, we're at 12th hour timing right here, and there has to be guidance for these folks to spend down so they qualify for Medicaid. And I think everybody on this call will agree with me. You don't like to be told what to do with your money. And clearly I don't. I know that my wife doesn't like to be told what to do with her money. But there's ways to avoid this, and that's going back to the hour one pre-planning. But for this discussion today, we're going to have the frowny face, and we got to spend down. So if we could go to the next slide, Claudia. Okay, so what is spend down? So spend down is essentially, you know this too, is that DHHS, in order to qualify for Medicaid, you have to become asset eligible and income eligible. All right. Looking at assets, what DHHS will look at is they'll look at everything that you work for all of your life. They'll look at your IRA. They'll look for the insurance policies. They'll look at the cottage and the hunting property, the vacation property. They'll look at your cash, what you have in the bank, CDs, money markets, that kind of stuff, investments. They'll take that all into consideration. So that's what Medicaid and DHHS is looking for when there's a Medicaid application filed. Do they financially qualify? That is, are they under $2,000 in assets? So if we could go to the next slide. So what counts and what doesn't count? So this is what counts. Again, I've talked about this: cash, IRA, CDs, money market accounts, investments, stocks, bonds, credit union savings, checking accounts, okay? Real estate that you don't live in, the cottage, the hunting property, the out-of-state, I'm going down south when it starts snowing. That's all countable assets that DHHS is looking at when they're determining Medicaid eligibility. So if we go to the next slide. The good news is what does DHH care less about, okay? And what they care less about, they don't care at all, is the primary home, the homestead, as long as it's under $636,000 fair market value. They don't care about the household and the personal items, okay? So they don't care about the china. They don't care about the towels. They don't care about the bookcase and the lamps and the stove. They don't care about that. They don't care about one vehicle. But if there's two vehicles, that is, if it's a couple and there's two vehicles, well, they're going to care about the second vehicle, but you are allowed to have one vehicle that is exempt. And they don't care about burial plans. And that's what Melissa Mitchell is going to talk about. And I'm going to try to speed up this as much as possible so we give her as much time to talk about this, because this is really crucial. Because you have to have the right burial plan for Medicaid DHHS to exclude that. So if we could go to the next. So the biggest thing that people have heard is the car. All right, you've heard it. People that walk through our door have heard it. And everybody has this idea that I can keep one car. Great. Well, what Medicaid does not want to see is they don't want to see the family going out and purchasing the Ferrari versus the minivan, the handicap accessible minivan, or the Camry, okay? That could raise some red flags with Medicaid, with DHHS, as to why did you buy the Ferrari? There's no way mom can fit into the Ferrari. And how are we going to get her wheelchair into the front? Because that's, I think, the The trunk is at the front and the engine's in the back with Ferraris. I don't know, I drive a Honda. But in any event, so we have to be cautious on what we define as an exempt motor vehicle. If we could go to the next slide. One thing that DHHS cares less about is mechanical repairs. So if you got a car that needs new tires, needs a new exhaust system, transmission issues, DHHS could care less if you spend money to make those repairs to that motor vehicle. Next slide. Well, what is a motor vehicle? So back in the day, DHHS considered motor vehicle the boat. They considered it a plane. Can you imagine showing up at the nursing home in a plane? But seriously, they used to consider that as an exempt asset, the truck, all right? But again, you only can have one of it. Now, I'm telling you right now that DHHS is really clamping down on that. And you're getting different interpretations from different offices and different caseworkers on what qualifies as a motor vehicle. We can go to the next slide. So a perfect example is that we have a DHH office that requires that the exempt car be parked at the nursing home. Okay, they require that. They are requiring that we show them a picture of the odometer to make sure that isn't being driven all, back and forth to Florida. They require a photograph of the odometer. And what is really crazy, if you can believe this, is that although you have an exempt motor vehicle, we have had one caseworker say, well, it's exempt, but if you go register that motor vehicle at the Secretary of State, well, we consider that divestment. Now, what kind of sense does that make? You can have a vehicle, but you can't register the darn thing. And so that's what we're faced with. And I'm sure you've seen some of that on your end as well. It's this inconsistency that goes throughout the various offices and the various caseworkers. So again, it's like the Alice in Wonderland. You just don't know what hole you're going to pop up at, depending on who you're working with and what office you're working with. If we could go to the next slide. So one of the spend down strategies that we do suggest to clients is they pay off their debt. All right, they pay off the mortgage, they pay off their credit card debt, they pay off the car loan, they pay off the utility bill that's been sitting there for a while, they pay off their cell phone bill. All right, but what we do not encourage and is prohibited is that folks cannot prepay debt. For instance, for an example, if you rent, you cannot prepay your rent. Okay. That is not an outstanding bill because that's a bill that has not been incurred yet until you actually rent that particular month. The same thing with utilities. You can't prepay your utilities. You can't prepay the cable bill, all right, because those bills are not yet due. So we have to be very cautious on how we advise clients on what debt they can pay off and what debt they can't pay off. Again, it's the Alice in Wonderland scenario. Another spend down strategy is that we'll have the folks go out and purchase medical devices that are not covered by insurance, such as dentures. And this kind of hits home with me right now because I've got some major cavities and I've joked with my dentist about getting dentures and he's like, that's not a joke. But you can get, glasses, you can get the high-end hearing aids. Those are all considered non-countable assets. But again, we have to start planning for this stuff at hour one instead of at the midnight hour. If we can go to the next slide. And so this goes hand in hand with what Melissa is going to talk about, planning. So like I said earlier, that you can plan for your funeral. And for example, we all know the Queen, right? And the planning that she took into consideration. I mean, it's my understanding that everything was planned all the way down to the flower arrangements, the floral arrangements. I've actually talked to folks that have come through this office that they have pre-planned their funeral to the extent that they have picked out the photographs that they want on the poster board. They have picked out the readings that they want to have happen at the service. They've picked out the music that they want. And so planning. I can't stress this enough. So if you folks run into families that have not planned, there's hope for them. I mean, there's stuff that we can do. We can do stuff on the 10th hour. We can do stuff on the 10th, 11th hour. There's stuff we can do on the 12th hour. But the goal is that if you get a family that's just kind of testing the water, so to speak, the first thing that you should be talking to those folks about is what plan do you have in place? And if they don't have a plan, you got to send them out to an attorney's office, hopefully to our office, so we can sit down with those folks to tell them what's at stake here. All right. And yeah, we would like the business. We would like you to refer them to us, but I don't care who you refer them to, but you got to refer them to somebody that understands the Medicaid process. You got to refer them to somebody that understands the Alice in Wonderland traps that people can fall into if they are not crossing their T's twice and dotted them twice. And it's really amazing to me that if attorneys have actually read the Medicaid plan playbook, okay, if they actually take the time and figure it out like we've done here at the office, it's gonna reduce almost to zero the stress that the family has to go through when it comes to this point in their lives. When mom or dad or husband or wife are going into skilled nursing care and the cost hits them in the face like they just been slapped, upside down. And so that's very important. But with the burial planning, I'm going to turn this over to Melissa Mitchell. So Melissa Mitchell has been in this business for 13 plus years. Okay. This is all she does day in and day out. She works with families to make sure that the burial planning is Medicaid compliant. And it's funny because I just learned the other day that Melissa was actually trained by a DHH caseworker that guided her through what needs to be done for making sure the funeral plan is Medicaid eligible. And that caseworker was Sarah Calabrese. And we actually at the office know Sarah Calabrese, and she's close and dear to our heart because she left DHHS and she came over to our office to work for us for a number of years. So we have worked very close with DHHS after they've left the office. We've worked very close with Melissa Mitchell and making sure our clients are taken care of, just like you do on your end, making sure your clients or your patients are taken care of and are given the best care that you guys can muster. So with that said, I'd like to introduce to you Melissa Mitchell. Melissa.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here today with all of you. I know that your primary concern is, taking care of your clients and your patients and helping them to get the support that they need. So Claudia, if you could move to the next slide for me. All right, so we'll start with the very basics. So funding documents, the burial funding documents for your funeral plan have to be irrevocable. And if some of you know this, just close your ears for just a second. I just want to make sure that we start with a very basic minimum here. So what does it mean when we make a burial document irrevocable? Well, basically, we are promising to use all of those funds for the benefit of the prospective decedent's burial and or service. So the family is promising to do that. Funds can be moved around at the time of death if changes need to be made. So that's a nice caveat in the plan. So if for some reason 10 years down the line, we need to make some adjustments to the plan, we can do that as long as we keep the changes within the funeral home. And we are not permitted to give a refund back to the family. Next slide, please. So some misconceptions we'll talk about. I hear time and time again, well, either my attorney or somebody at the nursing home said my funeral plan can't be any more than $13,760. Well, that number really only applies to funeral home services. So as long as we keep the funeral home services under that number, we are totally fine. And then we can add any other burial items that need to be used, such as a casket, an urn, any printed materials, any services costs at the church or the cemetery, or anything with the remarker. So the number that we have to work with is actually much greater than 13,760. And the good news is this number increases every single year, and it always generally happens in June. So we can look forward over the course of time that number will increase to help us with burial planning and protecting funds. Next slide, please. So another question that I often get is, can my insurance policy be used to pay for my funeral? And sometimes people even say, well, the attorney told me my insurance policy can be considered a prepaid funeral, or maybe they've heard that from the social worker or what have you. So the insurance policy can be used to pay for a funeral. Absolutely. That's what we would consider payment at the time of death. If you want to use an insurance policy for the payment, that is not considered a prepaid funeral plan. So another option that sometimes people will ask is, can I make my insurance policy irrevocable for the benefit of my Medicaid application? And then in the back of my mind, I know I'm using that for my funeral plan. Well, sometimes it works that way for a family to use that as an irrevocable assignment, and then they submit that to DHS for Medicaid. But sometimes it doesn't work. And it always doesn't work when you are thinking that you have a prepaid funeral plan. So it does act as payment, but only at the time of death. So costs have not been addressed. So if you are having a family that does a spend down and they have a $10,000 life insurance policy, and that person lives to be another 10 years, what happens over the course of that 10 years, just with anything, a dollar amount or the value of that funeral plan is going to increase, and sometimes nearly double within 10 to 15 years, depending on where you're living. So it's never really the best option for a family because, one, it does not take a plan into consideration to make sure things are in order for that family. It does not address the funeral home costs. And it can be very messy also in terms of the Medicaid application and how that particular DHS worker is looking at it. And lastly, the funeral home cannot make your policy irrevocable. That has to be done by the policy owner. So you can only imagine, we do not have that authority to call and make your life insurance policy anything. So the family, it falls upon the responsibility of the family to do that, to call the insurance company, have it be made irrevocable, and then submit it with their Medicaid application. And generally, that process can take weeks. And sometimes families don't have that long to wait. Next slide, please. So here's an interesting caveat to the Medicaid spend down using burial planning. So some of you might be aware of this, but it surprises me how many times families do come into plan for their funeral, and especially when they're trying to apply for Medicaid. This always, I generally will entertain and expose them to this idea. So using a burial space exclusion item as an additional spend down option. So first of all, the initial spend down is with the prospective decedent and or their spouse. They can come in, they can plan their service. The entire amount can be used as their spend down option. So what if they have both paid for their funerals and we still have $50,000 left, or $30,000 or $80,000, whatever the amount will be? Sometimes I actually encounter families that are racking their brain as to how they're going to get rid of the rest of the money so that they can get their Medicaid application in by the end of the month or within the next 30 days. I know that it sounds so crazy when people are trying to figure out how to spend money. So the state will actually allow an individual to pay for certain burial expenses for their children, their children's spouses, siblings, and sibling spouses. I know, crazy. A lot of times I know families or parents, that's the last thing they thought they would give their kids is money for their prospective funeral. But it is an option, and especially when we are out of ideas, we have exhausted all the other necessary spend down options, and now we're trying to figure out the rest of the plan. And sometimes, you know, parents do like this option because if they haven't had the opportunity to give their kids a gift, at least it's something that they can do. And so families do find this attractive. So what does this look like? So the state of Michigan requires that these items be a burial space item. What does that mean? Well, anything that would occur at a cemetery. So we're looking at a casket, a vault, opening and closing, markers, anything like that, flowers, any sort of an expense that would occur at the burial site. So we go ahead, we put those items into a third-party escrow account as we do with their own personal plan. And that money will hold there until the date of their death to be used for their burial plan. So what happens when that parent has paid for those things and maybe that child in 10 years or whatever, 20 years has decided, I don't think I want to use a casket. If they decide at the time of death that they want to make some changes to the plan, they absolutely can, just as anyone else can make a change to their plan. They can use those funds to make any modifications to the plan. Just as, like I said, if you have a burial plan and you know the document has been made irrevocable and you make changes that leave some available funds, you can choose to move the money around within the funeral home as long as it stays for the benefit of that person's funeral. Next slide, please. And if you have any questions on the burial space exclusion items, please feel free to put that in the Q&A, because I know a lot of times when we engage in this conversation, families do have questions on that. And I just covered this slide. Changes can be made to any plan at the time of death. Next slide, please. So let's talk about funeral policy. And some of you, this might be old hat, but sometimes people are kind of, you know, not sure how the state requires funeral homes to hold the money for the benefit of a funeral plan. And these policies are required for a Medicaid application. So we are required to put this money into a third-party account. This money is held there until the date of a person's death, and then it's transferred to the funeral home to pay for the plan. So they do this to protect the individual's funds, so that the last thing we want is when a person comes to our funeral home or to a funeral home and the money is no longer there because of maybe some dishonest embezzlement or things like that. And of course, you know, we always have a rotten apple in every bunch. The majority of funeral homes are in business to serve families, and they are very upright, honest, and equitable people. But the regulations are to protect our consumers. So the money does sit in that account. They are the owner of the plan until the time that they need it. We do have to provide a death certificate in order to have the money sent to the funeral home for payment of their plan. So what does this policy do for them? Well, it locks in all funeral home costs, funeral home services, funeral home merchandise. It also is protected by an insurance provider or a trust. So the insurance provider that we use here at Heritage is National Guardian Life. It is insured by the FDIC, and we also use a trust by the Michigan Funeral Directors Association. So also very secured. The money does earn interest over the course of time. We hope that that interest will keep up with the cost of inflation, and that's how we are able to guarantee the cost of the service. If the market does not keep up with inflation, the funeral home will write a credit to that funeral home plan, as we have promised to deliver these services for these costs at the time of the funeral payment. So a lot of times folks will see this as a savings as well. You're paying today's cost for future services. Also, this plan, because it's owned by the actual individual, it is transferable. So you can transfer this fund to any funeral provider in the country. So it works just like cash. And so if the building were to burn down, if our funeral home would go out of business, or the person simply just changes their mind, they can transfer it wherever they would like to go. There's only one additional document that needs to be signed. It's a very simple process. Sometimes families have had the opportunity to save for their funeral planning, and the least expensive option to pay for a funeral plan is one simple payment before death in this situation with a funeral policy. But sometimes families have not had the opportunity to save money, or maybe they just haven't, or they don't want to let go of the funds quite yet. We can do a payment plan. We do offer 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and 20 here at Heritage. There is a small premium put into that monthly payment in case the individual were to pass away before the completion of the term. So say, for example, the person took out a 10-year payment plan. The escrow or the insurance company would put a small premium into it in case they died in year 5. Because the last thing we want is a family making payments on a funeral plan 5 years after they've laid their loved one to rest. Also, that gives them protection during the payment period. And because the family is paying for their funeral plan under this program, the funeral policies is considered an exempt asset. Just this morning, I was meeting with a gentleman who came in to plan a funeral for his sister who is applying for Medicaid. And so I always do make copies for our families so that when that application comes due, they can simply submit all burial documents to DHS to make it a lot easier for them. Next slide, please. So, burial documents, yes, must be completed to the specifications set forth by the state of Michigan. The misconception here is that all funeral home staff are trained and knowledgeable in Medicaid compliant funding documents and options for burial space exclusions. Like Greg said, Medicaid has very specific requirements and specifications, and that also applies to burial planning documents. If things are not written correctly, then the burial document could be the reason for a Medicaid application denial. So many times people do call me to inquire to make sure that they are setting this document up for success, but knowing exactly how these documents have to be written, what things are permitted, what things aren't permitted for a Medicaid application is very important because it could hold up a Medicaid application. For example, one of the things that DHS does not like to see on a funeral plan is any accommodations for food. Kind of crazy. Because food is often generally a part of a funeral plan. I mean, there are, countless families that either offer refreshments or a funeral luncheon after the funeral is over. But DHS does not like to see any sort of expenses set aside for a funeral lunch. So if a funeral home does put that on there, the Medicaid application could be denied because of an incorrect burial document. So like Greg said, I've been working in funeral service for a very long time, and I feel very blessed that I was able to spend a lot of time with Sarah Calabrese, who did work for DHS in long-term Medicaid. And so there would be times where I would confer with her and learning along the way so that I could make sure my burial documents were never a reason that somebody's application was denied. Next slide, please. So anyway, this pretty much concludes the information regarding funeral planning. There are so many more details to it, but in the interest of time, I'm covering the basic parts of it. If you have any additional questions for me, or if maybe we talked about a certain component of it, please do not hesitate to call me. I would answer any question to the best of my ability for you. Even if somebody is not using our funeral home, that's totally fine. Give me a call. I will share whatever expertise I possibly can to help you.
Well, thanks, Melissa. And I'll just tell you folks right now, Melissa is the expert of the experts when it comes to this stuff. We rely on her substantially when we have questions regarding Medicaid compliant funeral plans. And so thanks for all the work that you do and working with the families and the help that you have given us here at the office. I did have a comment that I was talking way too fast, and so I apologize if I was just rambling there without making any sense. But at the end of the day, what this boils down to, folks, is that our folks, your folks, they have to plan on hour one, okay? Hour 12, we can work with the family and we can get the job done, but it involves a lot of work and a lot of wheels are spinning. There's a common thread that we have with you folks. I mean, we are here to serve our clients, your clients, to the best that we can, and I know you guys are doing the same. It's also the common thread that we want to get our clients, your clients, eligible for Medicaid, so it reduces the stress on the family when it comes to paying for long-term care. It helps you folks out, making sure that you guys are being compensated for the services that you provide. And I tell you, my mom went through long-term care, and I was blessed to have great quality care for my mom. And the folks that I've met with Chris, I see that in the passion and the eyes when I speak with you folks. And so the goal is that we are here to serve the clients the best that we can in the Alice in Wonderland world of Medicaid. And I think that Melissa commented on it, that there's a lot of misinformation out there. And when it comes to Medicaid and the application, if things are not done right, you're going to get zinged. They're going to get zinged, and they don't tell you why. So people cannot rely on attorneys or funeral home representatives that aren't in the trenches dealing with this kind of stuff day in and day out, because it can go sideways on folks very quickly when it comes to this stuff. So make sure if you are referring people out that you hopefully refer them out to us, because this is all we do day in and day out. But make sure that you're sending these folks to people that know what they're doing and are in the trenches day in and day out with Medicaid, with DHHS, and have a working relationship with you folks. So thank you for taking time out of your lunch.
We have some questions, Greg.
I see we have some questions. So Chris, if you want to just read those questions to me, and I'd be more than happy to respond. And or if they're from Melissa, fine, great.
Yeah. Can utilities at the previous home be paid for as an acceptable expense if the resident is not expected to return to that home and stay at the facility as a long-term resident?
Yes. As long as the home is in the client's name, the patient's name, that patient client is responsible for the utilities. So the answer to that question is yes. Again, you can't prepay it, but if it's a utility that is owed, that's completely acceptable with DHHS.
Can repairs be made to a previous home even though the resident is going to be long-term in the facility, such as updating a bathroom, maybe to make it compliant with a wheelchair or a ramp? Or
And that's a very good question. And I'm going to tell you that's an Alice in Wonderland question. Okay, it depends on what office you're working with and what caseworker you're working with. For example, we have a client that painted her house 4 years ago, had a licensed contractor. We're in Michigan. It was wear and tear. They needed to paint the house. Okay. And DHHS came back and said, no, that was just for aesthetic purposes, and that's divestment. And we are saying, what? Okay, because we're in Michigan, and that's upkeep of the house, maintenance of the house. There was no, I mean, yeah, it looks a lot better, but the primary purpose was to, to deal with maintenance. We had another case with a DHH worker that said building a ramp on dad's house so the son could get in and out of the house with ease was divestment. Crazy. Who in their right mind wants a ramp on their deck, right? And DHHS was arguing that it was an improvement to the son's house. Well, that stuff is crazy talk, but it's workers interpreting the rules the way that they want to interpret them. And in that particular case, dad remodeled his bathroom to make it accessible for his son when he comes over to visit to use the bathroom without having to be carried in and carried out. All right. DHHS contested that, saying that was divestment because it was improvement to dad's house. And by the way, we took that case to the court or circuit court, and we won. Okay. The worker was really stretching the rules on the interpretation of that. there was no added value to Dad's house, except for the fact that he got to see his son go in and out of the bathroom without any assistance from a third party. So again, that's an Alice in Wonderland question, all right? And you gotta be, my advice would be, you gotta talk to an attorney before you tell a client to go make repairs to the house, because some repairs will count, some repairs won't. So you really have to, I mean, that's a very gray area right now. And I'm telling you right now, DHHS is clamping down on that. Back in the day, wasn't an issue. This day and age, issue.
Should costs like credit card debt or other bills of debt be paid if needing to lower assets?
Absolutely. It's debt. It should be paid for. All right. So I would say, I mean, absolutely. And when my mom was one of these folks that she did not want to owe a dime, a nickel to anybody. That's how she lived her life. All right. So it was very important that she paid her debts. And so not only is it a good moral thing to do, but it's not going to impact Medicaid eligibility.
When somebody applying for Medicaid has no assets and a life insurance policy with a cash value, is it better to cash it out and spend that, or take it to the funeral home? I guess it depends the value of the insurance policy, right?
Right, so that's a very open question. There's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of assumptions that I would make. It could be depend on which way. I mean, based on the assumption and the specific facts would direct how to answer that that question. And so I guess I can't, you know, to fairness, I just can't give an answer because there's more facts that have to be incorporated in answering that question. And if I were to say something, it could be totally wrong to what's really going on. So I would say you'd really have to sit down with the attorney, sit down with Melissa, and we would figure out the strategy to best deal with that insurance policy.
So Melissa, if someone has no assets and they come, what would, if this was an insurance policy that would cover, let's just say, maybe a typical cost of a funeral home, what would that process be like?
Sure. So if you have a cash value in your whole life policy and it exceeds the amount that the DHS application will allow you to have, the best thing to do for the whole family, not just the prospective applicant, is to consider cashing that in so that you actually have the funds available, and then come in and plan and prepay for your funeral service. There are reasons for that. One, we have an intangible, which now we've got a plan in place for the family, which makes it so much easier at the time of death. The second thing is costs have been addressed for the funeral plan, because what happens is many times people will spend all their money on care, rent, medical, and they spend every last dime of mom and dad's money. And then who's left with the expense of planning a funeral? And that's generally the family. So, I say to them, the state of Michigan will help you with your Medicaid, or with your payment to the nursing home. They will help you with Medicare, with medical help, but they will not pay your funeral plan. There is not that available. So having the cost be addressed. And lastly, if you were to keep that policy intact for whatever reason that you've decided to do, somebody has to keep up the payments, because generally a whole life policy has a continual payment until it has been completely paid up. So the person on Medicaid generally isn't the one to do that. It falls on behalf of a family member. And most family members don't want to assume any other financial obligation indefinitely. So that's really one of the biggest reasons why people are like, oh, I don't want to deal with that, and so it tends to be the way to go. And also it's much cleaner for your Medicaid application. There's nothing, it's just very black and white when you send in your Medicaid application and you have a prepaid funeral plan on appropriate documents that the state will accept. Did
What's
answer
the max amount of face value a life insurance policy can be to be eligible for Medicaid?
Are you talking about a funeral plan?
Yeah, the maximum amount, I think of a life insurance policy. The maximum amount of the face value of a life insurance policy that can be eligible for Medicaid.
Well, I think for a life insurance policy, that fund has to be less than whatever, the $2,000 or the $1,500, whatever the state will allow you to keep. And so if it's anything over that, then the policy has to be dealt with in some fashion. Does that answer your question?
And Melissa, you're right on that. So we always have to remember that the asset cutoff for Medicaid eligibility is $2,000. Like we like to look at $1,500, but Melissa is correct with that. Life insurance cash value is $10,000. Okay, now we're $8,000 over Medicaid eligibility, and now that's called spend down. And what I think Melissa's saying, well, I can take that $8,000 of spend down and I can use that towards a prepaid funeral contract, and there's no harm, no foul. All right. But say the cash value is $50,000, and the best that Melissa can do is put a $25,000 plan in place. Okay, now I got some extra cash that's going to disqualify me for Medicaid eligibility unless I spend it down on like the motor vehicle or medical supply devices, debt, things that I just talked about. So it's really an open-ended question. And we've seen some situations where the family will buy out the cash value and they'll retain, it'll be assigned to them. They make the payments, and then when mom or dad passes away, well, they get the death benefit, right? And if they pay the cash value, well, then mom and dad have the cash value, it's cash in their hands. They go to Melissa, say, hey, I got 20 grand from surrendering this to my son or daughter. Then that's the one way that you can preserve the integrity of the life insurance policy.
Yeah,
So-
it really just depends on like every case is different in terms of what to do and how to handle it. And so you have to look at what the cash value is, what the premium is, and what the death benefit is to really help a family make that decision. And most of the time, most people only know about insurance is that they need it. So they don't always understand the ins and outs of how different policies are created and how they work. And so one of the nice things about the state requirement for advanced funeral professionals is that I do have to have a license in insurance. So sometimes just kind of going through that process of analyzing what's the best thing for the family. Now, in the end, they have to make the decision. It's their policy, it's their money. I'm not going to tell them what to do. I can just at least just educate them and advise them as like, okay, this is how it's going to work. This is what the advantages are. This is what the disadvantages are. And then from there, they would make the decision of what to do. Answer your question?
I think so. What if the life insurance policy face value is 20,000, but the cash surrender is 200?
So then again, the family has to decide, is it like most families will go, why keep this? They're going to end up paying all these premiums. So it's really up to them whether they want to continue to pay on that and keep it. So the $200 isn't going to get them very far. So generally, most families would go $200. That's it. We're just going to shut this thing down and be done with it. But it's really up to the family as to what they want to do.
You probably don't see many policies like that.
I don't see them with $200, but I do see families that come in with maybe, a $20,000 death benefit. Most of them are actually $10,000 because people think, well, that'll cover my funeral, and maybe they have $5,000, maybe they have $5,000 in their cash value. So now they get to decide, do I want to pull that money out, plan my service, know exactly what it's going to cost, and maybe they just take the $5,000 and that's what they spend on the funeral plan and they're done. And they never have to think about what they're going to do when their mom or dad or their loved one passes away. And sometimes they take the 5,000 and just apply it to a plan that maybe they want to spend 10,000. It's completely up to them and what their plan looks like. So they can utilize it as a really significant start to a down payment and then just add to it. And then again, the funds have been addressed, the costs have been addressed. And so it kind of takes that unknown out there of what is this funeral going to cost when my mom or dad dies or my loved one dies? Because if that person lives another 12 years, it could be a significant increase unless it's been prepaid. Right.
Well, I think that's the last question.
Okay.
So I want to thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing your expertise today, and Greg as well. If anyone has any questions, here's their contact information. Once I get the link for this, so for anyone who attended today, I will send that out to you again with Greg and Melissa's contact information as well.
Hey, Chris, before we sign off, just one last thing, and attorneys always like to get the last word in. I don't know why, it's something in our DNA, but in any event, so this information has been provided for educational purposes only. It's not legal advice. I'm just telling you guys, sit down with the attorney and figure this stuff out because it's very in the weeds specific. So this is just to give you folks an overview that there are resources out there that can be addressed in a positive way, both for your folks and to make sure they preserve what they've worked for all of their life. But again, if you want some really in the weeds answers to your questions, give me a call or give Melissa a call. We'd be happy to speak with you. Thanks.